This brings us to the discussion of how you interpret. And I don't think you interpret. I don't think you can interpret. Beethoven doesn't need an interpreter or a translator. Everything is there. That means you have to learn to read the score, which is different from reading a book. Because when you read a book, and it has also quite complex language, if you understand, if you have knowledge of the language, you understand the words, you get the sense. But you don't have to declaim it. Mm-hmm. When we see the notes, how they are written, what dynamic they are, what speed you want to take, and all that. This is not interpretation. Those who exaggerate have an inability to read the text properly. It's as if they read a text in a language that they know the alphabet but don't speak the words. To read the music, to read the text of Beethoven, and of all composers actually, to read the text means to understand, understand everything that the score says, but also to be able to examine the relativity of every information that you get. It says pianissimo. Pianissimo is not a fixed dynamic. Pianissimo is different after a piano, softer, or before a piano, where you can play a little more, because you can always play more on the piano, and so on and so forth, until fortissimo. And this relativity is not easy to understand, because it has to do with the structure of the music also. Every movement has basically to have one high point, one peak for the structure. And the high peak does not come necessarily on the last chord. And therefore, everything that leads to the peak has to be very, very cleverly understood. And when you see, for instance, piano crescendo. The first question one has to ask oneself is crescendo to what? Is it crescendo to mezzo forte? Is it crescendo to forte or to fortissimo? Then it's very important, just as important, to ask yourself in how long. Because if you have a long crescendo over 16 bars, you cannot afford to play it at the same speed of getting louder than if you have a crescendo over 2 bars. That has to be faster, because that's the time is not there. So this is what I mean, the connections, the relativity, because of the relativity. And if you are a master of understanding the connections and the relativity, as well as the precise understanding what note it is, how long, this is the interpretation. Each one of us will see relativity different, of course. And thank God for that. But this, for me, is what comes, as it were, instead of interpretation. Then you have, of course, the last degree, the degree of what is acceptable or even necessity of a certain very discrete flexibility of tempo changes. Certain phrases require a little more time or a forward motion. But this is what the Italians call rubato, which means stolen. Now, what do you do when you steal something? You give it back somewhere, somehow. Otherwise, you go to jail. When you play the rubato and you don't give back, you don't go to jail, but you've completely ruined the passage. Therefore, it is a very, very detailed analysis that is required.
Absolutely. And especially Beethoven, I think, poses us a challenge because the score and the way he wrote music is very detailed for the time. If we think, you know, a few decades before, if we open a Mozart sonata, for example, we see barely piano, forte, and some crescendo here and there, but very little, exactly. While with Beethoven, not only he uses the full scale from pianissimo to fortissimo in the piano, not only the pedal, which you spoke about, but also one thing that I think he just invented in piano writing, this idea crescendo and then subito piano.
But this is his invention.
Absolutely.
The subito piano is his invention, and this is what I consider the proof that he was a very strong character, because he had the courageous, not strong, courageous, because he has the character, the courage to write crescendo. Others have done that too. And you go to a certain point, and that certain point must be just before the precipice. And then you cut and you place subito piano. But unless you do that, the phrase doesn't have the necessary intention. A pianist that is unable to play a crescendo to the precipice and then come down suddenly, piano subito means sudden, suddenly, cannot do it. It is not possible to do, and it is very difficult to do. As also with the pedal, it's very difficult to do because I'm afraid too many piano teachers don't teach that the pedal is different if you put the pedal down before you play the chord, or you put the pedal down as you play the chord, or you put the pedal down after the chord, which gives it a sort of belated warmth. Mm-hmm. And all of these things are very important. And all these thoughts, for me, are in fact the so-called interpretation. I really don't like that word. I really don't like that word. It's only used for people who don't really know how to read the music and think, to sort of describe what has happened. They say the interpretation was too lyrical. What is lyrical for you may be dramatic for me. Or they say the interpretation was too free.
What is
Why?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
How come?
And again, we are back to the understanding of harmony, or the understanding of how Beethoven wrote these pieces. One thing that
the greatest lesson I have learned from playing Beethoven is that it's not enough to feel the music. It's not enough to have the intellectual capacity to analyze the music, but you need the ability to think in and with the music. To think, because music has this peculiarity that it is part of our world. We play it in front of people or at home, but it is also a world in itself. And the world in itself is almost a parallel to life, really, without music, our life, with certain aspects that make me think that it is richer. Every piece of music starts from nothing, from zero, from silence. Like a baby is born, and it is here. Then it develops, and then it dies. So in certain pieces of music, you really have the feeling, I don't know, I was never dead, obviously, but this is how I imagine the end to be. And all these thoughts, and the philosophical thoughts that are necessary in the study of the Beethoven sonatas, really enriches one not only pianistically or musically, but as a human being. I firmly believe that.